A mechanic showed up for career day at his son's school in dirty work clothes. The parents in suits looked at him with surprise, and some even scoffed. But what happened next turned everything upside down. Subscribe and write in the comments what city you are from. The air smelled of gasoline and warm metal, mingling with the lingering scent of oil that clung to the concrete floor of Carter Auto Service. Inside the small garage, nestled on the outskirts of Atlanta, the morning sun cast long streaks of golden light through the dust-speckled windows, illuminating the clutter of wrenches, gears, and half-dismantled engines. The rhythmic hum of a power drill mixed with the occasional clank of a metal tool hitting the workbench, creating a familiar symphony of labor. Jerome Carter wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a faint smudge of grease on his dark brown skin. He had been working since dawn, sleeves rolled up, his well-worn coveralls already smeared with oil and grime. His workshop was modest, just 2 bays, a narrow office tucked in the corner, and a few rows of spare parts lining the walls. But it was his own. He had built it from the ground up, pouring years of sweat and effort into making it the trusted repair shop it was today. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up. The hum of cars rolling past the shop's entrance, the distant chatter of people heading to work, and the occasional blare of a horn formed the backdrop to his routine. He barely noticed it anymore. His world was here, in the scent of rubber and the familiar weight of a wrench in his hand. The large metal garage door had been left halfway open, letting in a cool breeze that carried the scent of cut grass and morning dew. An old Ford truck sat on the lift, its hood propped open as Jerome inspected its stubbornly silent engine. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. Rogers, sat nearby on a rusted metal chair, watching with quiet patience. "She's an old girl," Mr. Rogers murmured, arms crossed over his chest. "She's got a few more years in her," Jerome replied, his voice steady as he reached for a socket wrench. "Just needs some love." Mr. Rogers chuckled, nodding. He had been coming to Jerome's shop for years, trusting no one else to keep his truck running. It was part of the reason why the garage, despite its unassuming appearance, had such a loyal customer base. Jerome didn't just fix cars, he took care of them, treating each repair like a puzzle that deserved his full attention. Just as he tightened the last bolt, a familiar voice cut through the ambient noise of the shop. "Dad?" Jerome turned his head, spotting his son, Ty, standing in the doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder. The boy's school uniform was crisp, his sneakers still bright from their recent purchase. His face, a smaller reflection of Jerome's own, was beaming with barely contained excitement. "You remember what today is, right?" Ty asked, stepping inside and dodging a stray oil pan on the floor. Jerome pulled himself up from under the truck, tossing the wrench onto his workbench. He wiped his hands on a rag, trying to recall what his son was talking about. Ty's expression made it clear that this wasn't just a casual question, it was a test. "Dad," the boy pressed, his voice urgent, "career day, at school, you said you'd come." And then it hit him. Career day. He had promised Ty that he would come to his school, stand in front of his classmates, and talk about what he did for a living. It had seemed like a small thing when he had agreed to it a week ago, but now, standing in his grease-streaked coveralls, surrounded by the remnants of a half-dismantled engine, the reality of it set in. His son was looking at him expectantly, eyes full of pride and excitement, completely oblivious to the fact that Jerome felt wildly unprepared. "Of course I remember," Jerome said, forcing a grin. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." Ty exhaled, relief spreading across his face. "Good," he said. Because I told everyone my dad is the best mechanic in the world, and they're all waiting to hear about it." Jerome chuckled, ruffling his son's neatly combed hair despite the boy's protests. All right, he said. "I'll be there, on time, I promise." Satisfied, Ty adjusted his backpack and turned toward the door. "See you there, Dad," he called over his shoulder before running outside to catch the school bus. Jerome watched him go, a small smile still lingering on his lips. Then he turned back to the Ford truck, exhaling as the reality of his promise settled in. Career day. Standing in front of a room full of well-dressed parents, doctors, lawyers, engineers, trying to explain why fixing cars was just as important as drawing up legal contracts or performing surgery. He shook his head, pushing the thought aside. There was still a full day ahead of him. Plenty of time to figure out how to make an oil-stained mechanic sound impressive. He picked up his wrench and got back to work. The hours inside Carter Auto Service passed the way they always did, quietly, steadily, measured by the sounds of engines idling, wrenches clicking against bolts, and the occasional hiss of compressed air. The morning haze had burned away into a crisp, bright afternoon, and the open garage doors framed a world moving at its own pace. Jerome Carter worked with the same patience he always did, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he inspected the Ford truck's cooling system. Mr. Rogers, ever the patient customer, had left an hour ago, trusting Jerome to call him when the job was finished. It was one of the things Jerome loved about his shop. There was a trust here, a sense of familiarity with his customers. People came to him not just because they needed a repair, but because they knew he wouldn't cheat them, wouldn't cut corners. He straightened, rolling his shoulders to shake off the stiffness. The midday heat pressed against his skin, beads of sweat gathering at his temples. He reached for a rag to wipe his face just as the phone rang from inside the shop's cramped office. Wiping his hands against the rough fabric of his coveralls, Jerome stepped inside, grabbing the receiver. "Carter Auto." A hurried voice on the other end crackled through the old speaker. It was one of his longtime customers, a trucker named Ray Middleton. "Jerome, man, I need your help," Ray said, voice tight with urgency. "I got a load to haul to Memphis, but my rig won't start. It's stuck on Broad Street right near the diner. I think it's the alternator." Jerome glanced at the clock above the office door. It was just after 1. He hesitated. "I can't be late today," he muttered to himself, gripping the phone tighter. But leaving Ray stranded wasn't an option either. The man had been his customer for years, always paid on time, always trusted Jerome to get him back on the road. He could already picture Ray standing beside his 18-wheeler, checking his watch, growing more anxious by the minute. "All right," Jerome said. "Give me 15 minutes. I'll bring my tools." He hung up, exhaling slowly. 15 minutes, maybe 20. If he worked fast, he could still make it to the school on time. Stepping out of the office, he grabbed his toolbox and threw it into the back of his truck. The keys jingled in his grip as he slid into the driver's seat, turned the ignition, and pulled out onto the sun-baked street. The drive to Broad Street was short, but the traffic at this hour was heavier than he expected. He tapped the steering wheel impatiently, watching the red light that refused to change. The minutes ticked away, too fast for his liking. By the time he pulled up next to Ray's rig, it was already 1:20. Ray stood beside his truck, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He was a broad-shouldered man, his cap pulled low over tired eyes. He exhaled in relief when he saw Jerome stepping out of the truck. "Man, I owe you for this," Ray said. "Let's just get you back on the road," Jerome replied, already popping the hood. The alternator was shot. He could see that in an instant. The belt was loose, the housing streaked with grime and wear. He reached for his tools and set to work. The sun was relentless, beating down on the pavement as sweat gathered at the nape of his neck. He worked quickly, fingers moving with practiced ease, the world narrowing down to bolts and wires, tension and precision. Another glance at the clock. 1:35. Almost there. A final twist of the wrench, a test of the connections, and then the truck roared to life. Ray let out a relieved chuckle, clapping Jerome on the back. "You're a lifesaver," he said. "Let me at least." Jerome was already backing away, stuffing his tools into the box. "No time," he said. "I gotta be somewhere." He climbed back into his truck, throwing it into gear before Ray could protest. The clock on the dashboard read 1:45. 15 minutes to make it to the school. His heart pounded as he weaved through traffic, pushing the speed limit but not enough to risk getting pulled over. He could already picture the auditorium, rows of children sitting in neat lines, parents standing in pressed suits, polished shoes gleaming under the fluorescent lights. And then there would be Ty, searching for him in the crowd, waiting for his turn to stand in front of the class and introduce his father. A promise was a promise. The school building came into view just as the clock turned to 1:55. 5 minutes. He pulled into the parking lot, barely throwing the truck into park before grabbing his keys and bolting toward the entrance. His hands were still streaked with grease. His coveralls were smudged, his hair damp from sweat. There hadn't been a second to clean up, not even a moment to wipe his face. But there was no time to think about that now. He pushed open the school doors and hurried inside. The hallway smelled of freshly polished floors and the faintest hint of crayons, paper, and whatever industrial-strength cleaning solution the janitors used to keep the school looking pristine. The walls were lined with cheerful posters, handmade drawings of historical figures, motivational quotes in bright construction paper letters, and a bulletin board displaying colorful projects from the 4th grade science fair. Jerome barely noticed any of it. His boots, heavy and stained with oil, clapped against the tiled floor as he hurried toward the auditorium. He could hear the distant hum of voices, hundreds of them all gathered inside, waiting. His heartbeat thudded in his ears, drowning out everything else. Pushing through the double doors at the back of the room, he was met with a wave of cool, air-conditioned relief and the sight of a packed auditorium. Rows upon rows of neatly arranged chairs were filled with students sitting cross-legged on the floor in front, while their parents stood in the back, watching the presentations unfold. On stage, a man in a navy blue suit, crisp white shirt, and a silk tie gestured confidently as he spoke. And that's why practicing law isn't just about knowing the rules. It's about fairness, about protecting people who can't always protect themselves. A polite ripple of applause followed as the lawyer stepped down from the podium, shaking hands with the principal on his way to rejoin the other parents. Jerome barely had a chance to catch his breath before he took in the scene in full. The parents here looked nothing like him. They stood in tailored suits, polished shoes, dresses that looked as though they had never seen a wrinkle. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, people whose professions carried prestige, whose presence alone commanded a certain kind of respect. And then there was him. He was still in his work coveralls, the dark fabric streaked with grease. His hands, though wiped hastily against his pant legs, still bore smudges of oil, and his boots left faint traces of dust against the glossy floor. A faded baseball cap sat atop his head. his attempt at covering the sweat-dampened mess of his hair. He felt the weight of their gazes almost immediately. Some were subtle, just a flick of an eye before turning away. Others weren't. A woman in pearl earrings wrinkled her nose slightly before shifting her purse to the other arm, as if distancing herself from the lingering scent of gasoline and metal. A man in a pinstriped suit gave him a quick up-and-down glance, his expression unreadable before he returned his attention to the stage. Jerome exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay grounded. He had walked into rooms like this before, into banks when applying for his first loan, into auto part dealerships where the salesman had assumed he was just another broke mechanic trying to haggle over a distributor cap. He had never cared much what people thought of him then. So why did it feel different now? Because this time, Ty was here. Scanning the crowd, his eyes landed on his son near the front, sitting cross-legged between two other boys. Ty's face lit up instantly when he spotted him. He didn't notice the way the other parents looked at Jerome. He didn't see the grease-stained hands, the dusty boots, or the fact that his father was the only one in the room who hadn't had time to change into something more presentable. All he saw was his dad. Jerome raised a hand in a small wave, and Ty grinned, waving back with uncontained enthusiasm. "Dad's here," he whispered loudly to his friends, nudging one of them with his elbow. The boy next to him nodded, glancing back at Jerome with a curious expression before returning his attention to the stage. That simple moment, the pride in his son's face, settled something deep inside Jerome's chest. It didn't matter how he looked, not to Ty. The principal, a petite woman in a tailored navy blazer, stepped up to the microphone. She smiled warmly at the audience before glancing at her clipboard. "Our next student would like to introduce his father," she announced. "Ty Carter, you're up." Ty scrambled to his feet, brushing off his khaki pants before jogging toward the stage. He climbed the few steps up to the podium, gripping the microphone with the same excitement he'd had that morning. "This is my dad," he declared proudly. "His name is Jerome Carter, and he's the best mechanic in the city." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some of the children turned toward each other, whispering. A few of the parents exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from polite neutrality to mild curiosity. Jerome exhaled, squaring his shoulders as he prepared to step onto the stage. And then, as if on cue, he felt it. That small, creeping hesitation. It wasn't stage fright. He wasn't afraid of talking in front of people. He had argued with stubborn suppliers, explained engine diagnostics to customers who barely knew the difference between a spark plug and a fuel injector. He had confidence in his craft, in the work he did. But standing in a room full of people who measured success in boardrooms and medical degrees, he felt the quiet weight of comparison settle over him. As he climbed the stage steps, he reminded himself why he was here. For Ty. He reached the podium, gripping its edges for a second before glancing down at his son, whose face shone with expectation. Whatever nervousness had begun to curl around his chest dissipated with that single look. He cleared his throat and turned to face the audience. "Hi, I'm Jerome Carter," he said, "and I fix cars." The words hung in the air for a moment, and in that pause Jerome could hear the faintest shift in the room. The murmurs quieted. The weight of polite silence settled in, waiting. He had their attention. Now, all he had to do was keep it. Jerome Carter stood at the podium, gripping its edges with steady hands. The silence that followed his introduction was heavier than he had expected, stretching across the room like an invisible weight pressing against his chest. 100 eyes were fixed on him, some curious, some indifferent, and a few with the barely perceptible flicker of doubt. From the front row, Ty beamed up at him, his hands clasped together on his lap, anticipation written all over his face. That was what mattered. Not the murmurs that had followed his son's introduction, not the stiff-backed posture of the parents standing at the back of the auditorium. Still, the contrast between himself and the previous speaker, the sharp-dressed lawyer with his polished speech about justice and integrity, was impossible to ignore. Jerome had spent the last hour elbow-deep in an engine, had driven straight here without changing, without so much as rinsing the grease from his hands. His coveralls, though sturdy and familiar, felt out of place under the bright fluorescent lights of the school auditorium. He took a breath, steadying himself, and leaned slightly into the microphone. "As my son said, I'm a mechanic," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I fix cars, trucks, motorcycles, anything with an engine, really." A ripple of movement passed through the room. A few students sat up a little straighter. One boy in the second row whispered something to his friend, and a girl in the back tilted her head, as if suddenly paying closer attention. Jerome saw some of the parents exchange glances. He could almost hear the unspoken thought passing between them. That's it? That's the whole introduction? A few of them, he was sure, were waiting for him to stumble, to falter under the weight of their expectations. Maybe they thought he would mumble a few sentences about working with his hands before awkwardly stepping down. They didn't know that Jerome Carter never stumbled when it came to talking about his craft. He straightened his posture and continued, his voice gaining a quiet confidence. "You might not think about it much, but cars," he gestured toward the children, scanning the room as he spoke, "are one of the most important things in our lives. They take your parents to work, they take you to school, they get people where they need to go, whether it's across town or across the country." He let the thought settle before adding, "And when they break down, it's my job to make sure they get back on the road safely." A murmur of recognition spread among the children, and even a few parents seemed to nod slightly, as if finally considering the reality of what he was saying. "I started working on cars when I was about your age," Jerome continued. "I didn't have anyone to teach me, not at first. My family didn't have much money growing up, and when our car broke down, there was no calling a mechanic. We had to figure it out ourselves. So that's what I did." His voice softened slightly, a note of reflection creeping in. "The first car I ever worked on was a beat-up old Chevy my uncle had sitting in his backyard. It hadn't run in years, but I was determined to fix it. I spent weeks taking it apart, putting it back together, making mistakes, learning from them. I didn't have YouTube back then," he added with a faint smile, glancing at the students. "So I had to learn by trial and error." A small ripple of laughter ran through the crowd. A boy in the front row raised his hand. "Did you fix it?" Jerome nodded. "Eventually. It wasn't pretty, and it sure didn't run like new, but I got that old Chevy moving again. And when I did, I realized something. I loved this work. The way an engine comes together, the way every little part has to be in place for it to function. It's like a puzzle, and when you solve it, there's no better feeling." Now the children were leaning forward, their earlier restlessness replaced by genuine interest. Even some of the parents, Jerome noticed, had stopped checking their watches. "But here's the thing," he went on, letting his gaze sweep across the audience. "Being a mechanic isn't just about turning wrenches and getting your hands dirty. It's about problem solving. It's about understanding how things work. And it's about trust." The room had gone completely still. "People come to me when their cars break down. Sometimes in the middle of nowhere, sometimes when they're stranded on the side of the road at night. They don't know what's wrong, but they trust that I do. They trust that I can fix it. A woman in the back, a mother in a crisp blazer who had barely looked at him when he walked in, nodded slightly, her expression shifting from detached politeness to something more thoughtful. Jerome continued, sensing the shift in the room. I've had customers tell me that without their car, they can't get to work. That if they don't make it in time, they'll lose their job. I've had parents break down in my shop, worried they won't be able to pick up their kids because their car won't start. When I fix a car, I'm not just fixing an engine. I'm making sure someone gets where they need to go. I'm making sure a mother can drive her baby to the doctor, that a father can make it home after a long shift, that a trucker can deliver food across the state. He let the words settle, then exhaled. I take pride in that. Silence stretched for a beat, then another, and then, unexpectedly, a single clap rang out. Jerome glanced up, startled, as he saw Ty sitting in the front row, beaming as he clapped his hands together, undeterred by the lack of response around him. A second later, another pair of hands joined in. Then another. And suddenly, the room filled with the sound of applause. It wasn't thunderous, wasn't the kind of standing ovation the lawyer before him had received, but it was real. Parents who had barely glanced at him when he walked in were now nodding with quiet approval. A few children were still whispering excitedly among themselves, some of them glancing at their parents with newfound appreciation. Jerome let out a slow breath, allowing himself the smallest smile. He hadn't needed a fancy speech. He had just needed to tell the truth. For a few moments, Jerome simply stood there, feeling the echo of the applause fade into a thoughtful hush. He hadn't expected that reaction. He had expected polite silence, maybe a few half-hearted claps out of obligation. But this was different. He could see it in the faces of the parents, in the way some of them had softened their expressions, as if reevaluating their first impression of him. He saw it in the students, too, the way their eyes shone with curiosity. He wasn't just another speaker going through the motions. He had their attention now, and he couldn't waste it. A boy in the back row raised his hand, his small fingers twitching with eagerness. Have you ever fixed a race car? Jerome let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. Not a full-blown race car, no, he admitted. But I did work on a sports car once, a Mustang GT. A customer brought it in after trying to fix it himself. Said he just tinkered with a few things under the hood. A few of the kids giggled. Even some of the parents smiled knowingly. So, what happened? Another student asked. Jerome crossed his arms, leaning slightly against the podium as he thought back to that day. Well, the guy was sure he'd done everything right. But when he started the engine, instead of that smooth, powerful roar a Mustang is supposed to have, it made the worst sputtering noise you could imagine. Sounded like an old lawnmower struggling to stay alive. More laughter rippled through the room. Jerome felt the tension in the air ease, the stiffness of the formal setting giving way to something more natural, more engaged. So, I popped the hood and took a look. Turns out, he had mixed up a few of the ignition coil wires and had tried adjusting his own timing belt without knowing what he was doing. Instead of making his car faster, he nearly ruined his entire engine. The boy who had asked the question nodded with wide eyes. Did you fix it? Jerome nodded. Took me a few hours, but yeah. When I was done, that car sounded exactly the way it was supposed to. Smooth, strong, and fast. The customer was so happy he swore he'd never touch his own engine again. The kids laughed again, and even some of the parents chuckled in quiet understanding. Jerome let them have the moment before shifting gears. "You know," he continued, "a lot of people think being a mechanic is just about knowing how to replace parts. They think it's all just nuts and bolts, something anyone with a tool set can do. But that's not true." The murmuring quieted as the students leaned in again. Fixing a car isn't just about swapping out broken pieces. It's about understanding how everything works together. An engine isn't just metal and oil and wires. It's a system, and if one part isn't doing its job, the whole thing falls apart. And that's a lot like— He paused, glancing at the students before finishing, "a lot like life." A hush fell over the auditorium. Even the parents seemed to be listening more intently now. "In my job, I don't just fix cars, I solve problems. I look at something that's not working, figure out why, and make it right again. Sometimes it's something simple, a worn-out spark plug, a loose wire. Other times it's something complicated, something buried deep that you can't see right away. But no matter what, the most important thing is to take your time, pay attention, and figure it out the right way." The principal, who had been standing off to the side with her clipboard, nodded slightly, as if she hadn't quite expected this kind of perspective from him. A girl in the front row raised her hand. "How did you learn all this?" Jerome thought about it. About the long days spent in his uncle's backyard, the frustration of trial and error, the stubborn engines that refused to turn over no matter how many times he tried. "I learned because I had to," he said, "because no one was going to do it for me. But also because I wanted to. I liked the challenge. I liked figuring things out. And I'll tell you something, not everything I know came from books or school. A lot of it came from working with my own hands, from making mistakes, from trying again until I got it right." He saw a few of the parents exchange glances at that. Perhaps they were the kind of people who had spent years in school, earning degrees that dictated their careers. Maybe the idea of learning through doing, rather than studying, was foreign to them. But for the kids, it made sense. Another hand shot up. "So, do you think I could be a mechanic?" Jerome looked at the boy who had spoken. He was probably 10 or 11, his sneakers scuffed, his hair slightly messy. The kind of kid who probably spent his afternoons taking apart toy cars just to see how they worked. "If you want to be," Jerome said. "If you like solving problems. If you like using your hands to build something real, something people need. Then yeah, you could be a great mechanic. Or an engineer. Or a pilot. Or whatever you want." The boy grinned, as if he had just discovered something new about himself. Jerome turned his gaze back to the audience as a whole. "I know that some jobs seem more impressive than others," he said. "I know that some people wear suits and ties and some wear coveralls like me. But a job isn't about what you wear. It's about what you do. And if what you do helps people, if it matters to someone, then it's important. Whether it's fixing a car or defending someone in court or saving lives in a hospital, it all matters." Silence stretched for a beat, then another, and then, just like before, Ty clapped first. This time it didn't take long for the others to follow. The applause grew, not forced, not polite, but real. Some of the parents who had hesitated before now nodded with something resembling respect. A few even clapped a little harder. Jerome stepped back from the podium, exhaling slowly. He had come here expecting to feel out of place. But now, looking at Ty's glowing expression, at the curious, thoughtful faces of the students, he realized something. He hadn't needed to prove himself to anyone. All he had to do was tell his story, and let the rest speak for itself. As the last round of applause died down, Jerome stepped away from the podium, feeling a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying finally lift from his shoulders. He hadn't walked onto that stage expecting to command the room. He had walked in expecting to endure it, to get through the presentation for Ty's sake, say what needed to be said, and leave without making much of an impression. But something had shifted. He could feel it in the way the students looked at him now, and the subtle change in how some of the parents regarded him. He made his way off the stage and took a seat in the back of the auditorium, blending into the rows of standing parents as the principal stepped forward to thank the participants. His breathing was steady now, his heartbeat no longer racing. Ty was still beaming from his seat near the front, his small hands clasped in his lap, eyes bright with pride. That alone was worth everything. The next speaker, a woman in a starched navy uniform with polished silver wings pinned to her chest, began her presentation about being a commercial airline pilot. Jerome listened absently, though his mind was still half occupied by what had just transpired. Then he noticed something. A woman in a light gray dress suit had turned slightly in his direction, leaning toward another parent, a man with a neatly combed beard and thick-rimmed glasses. "I never thought about mechanics like that," she murmured. "I mean, of course they're important, but the way he explained it, it's different. Makes you realize how much we take it for granted." The man nodded, his brow furrowing in thought. "Yeah, it's not just fixing cars, it's keeping people moving. It's making sure people can get where they need to be." He glanced at Jerome then, catching his eye for the briefest moment before looking away, almost sheepishly. Jerome didn't react, but inside, something settled. He hadn't just spoken to the kids, he had spoken to the parents, too. The event continued, each new speaker bringing a different kind of energy to the room. A surgeon spoke about high-pressure decisions in the operating room. A firefighter described the adrenaline of responding to emergencies. The pilot explained the intricacies of navigating through turbulent skies. Every profession, every experience, each with its own weight, its own value. But the part that surprised Jerome the most wasn't during another speech. It was after. When the final speaker had stepped down and the principal returned to the stage to thank the guests, the room began to stir with quiet chatter. Some parents made their way toward their children, greeting them with warm smiles, ready to leave. Others lingered, engaged in small conversations. Jerome turned, thinking he might slip out quietly. He had done what he came to do, but before he could take a step, a woman approached him. "Mr. Carter?" He turned to see a woman with dark brown hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. She wore a deep green blazer and black slacks, her posture straight but not stiff. "That was a great presentation," she said. "I mean it. My son, he's been obsessed with machines since he was little. He loves taking things apart, but I think he always felt like that wasn't as important as what his dad does. His father's a corporate attorney." She gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "I think today, hearing you talk about what you do, he saw something different. So, thank you." Jerome blinked, caught slightly off guard. "I appreciate that," he said finally. "Really?" She nodded, glancing toward the exit where a young boy, no older than 10, was waiting for her. He had thick glasses and an oversized backpack, his small hands clutching the straps tightly. "Have a good afternoon," she said, before turning and walking toward her son. Jerome stood there for a moment, letting the encounter settle. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but it hadn't been that. He turned, scanning the room for Ty, only to find that his son was already hurrying toward him. "Dad?" Jerome barely had time to brace himself before Ty barreled into him, wrapping his arms tightly around his waist. "You were amazing," Ty exclaimed, his voice full of excitement. "Everyone loved it. Did you see how many kids were listening? And some of the parents even came up to me after and said my dad had the best story." Jerome laughed, ruffling his son's hair. "You saved me up there, kiddo," he admitted. "If it wasn't for you, I might have just stood there staring at the microphone." Ty grinned. "No way. You were awesome." Before Jerome could respond, another small voice piped up beside them. "Mr. Carter?" They both turned to see a boy, no older than Ty, standing there with wide, hopeful eyes. His father stood a few steps behind him, watching with an amused expression. "My dad doesn't know how to fix cars at all," the boy said, as if this was a serious flaw that needed immediate correcting. "Do you think you could teach him?" Jerome chuckled, glancing at the man who simply shrugged with a helpless grin. "I think we can arrange something," Jerome said, and the boy brightened immediately. As the father and son moved on, Ty tugged at Jerome's sleeve. "Are you going to come back next year?" Jerome raised an eyebrow. "Already planning for next year, huh?" Ty nodded vigorously. "Yeah. I mean, what if there are new kids who haven't heard your story yet? You have to come back." Jerome exhaled, glancing around the room once more. He hadn't expected to enjoy this. He hadn't expected to feel proud, but he did. "All right," he said finally, nudging Ty's shoulder. "Next year, same time, same place." Ty let out a victorious whoop, pumping his fist in the air before leading the way toward the exit. As they stepped outside, the warm afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the pavement. The school parking lot was filled with parents and children heading to their cars, voices overlapping in a chorus of end-of-day conversations. Jerome placed a hand on Ty's shoulder as they walked, listening to his son excitedly retell every moment of the presentation as if his father had just delivered the most legendary speech in history. And for the first time in a long while, Jerome didn't feel out of place. He might not have worn a suit, and his hands might have been covered in grease, but today, in his son's eyes, he had been the most important man in the room. And that was all that mattered. As Jerome and Ty made their way out of the school building, the late afternoon sunlight stretched long, golden streaks across the pavement. The air was warm, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass from the nearby football field. The school parking lot was still bustling with parents and children, some lingering in conversation, others piling into their cars, ready to return to the rhythm of their daily lives. Jerome felt lighter than he had in weeks. There was something deeply satisfying about the way things had unfolded in the auditorium. He had walked in expecting to be tolerated at best, dismissed at worst. Instead, he had walked away knowing that what he said had meant something, not just to Ty, but to more people than he had expected. Ty, still brimming with excitement, was practically bouncing beside him as they made their way toward the truck. "You were the best speaker today, Dad," he said, his voice buzzing with energy. "I mean, the firefighter was pretty cool, and the pilot had some neat stories, but no one else explained stuff like you did. Even my friends said so." Jerome chuckled, unlocking the truck and tossing his toolbox into the back. "Your friends said that, huh?" "Yeah. Caleb said his dad always talks about how hard it is to find a good mechanic, and when you started talking about trust, he was like, 'Whoa, my dad says the same thing.'" Jerome smiled, shaking his head as he slid into the driver's seat. As much as he had enjoyed the moment, it still felt strange to hear people talking about his work like that, as something meaningful beyond just repairing engines. Before he could start the truck, he noticed someone approaching from the corner of his eye. A well-dressed woman, the same one who had spoken to him earlier, was walking toward them with a confident stride. She wasn't alone this time. Beside her was another parent, a man in a sharp blazer, his car keys jingling in his hand. They both looked like they had just come from an office meeting rather than a school event, their polished shoes clicking softly against the asphalt. Jerome rolled down his window as they reached the truck. "Mr. Carter," the woman greeted with a warm smile. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "Not at all," Jerome said, resting one hand on the steering wheel. "I just wanted to say again how much I appreciated your talk today," she continued. "It really put things in perspective. My husband and I were just talking about it, how we don't really think about all the work that goes into something as simple as being able to drive wherever we need to go. You made it feel important." Jerome hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Well, that's because it is important," he said simply. "Maybe it's not the kind of job people dress up for, but if nobody did it, the world wouldn't run the way it does." The man standing next to her, who had been quiet until now, cleared his throat. "That's actually why I wanted to speak to you," he said. "My wife and I were discussing it, and we realized we've been needing some work done on our car. Our regular guy is decent, but after hearing you talk about how you approach things, I feel like I'd rather take it to someone who actually cares about the job." Jerome lifted a brow slightly, studying the man's expression. There was no hesitation there, no trace of the polite indifference he had seen in so many others earlier that day. "You can bring it by the shop any time," Jerome said finally. "Carter Auto Service, right off Broad Street." "That's the one." The man's brows lifted. "I think I've passed it a few times. Never realized that was your shop." "Been running it for years," Jerome said. "If you bring the car in, I'll take a look." The man nodded, seeming pleased. "Sounds good. I'll swing by this week." The woman smiled again. "Thanks again for today, Mr. Carter. I think a lot of people walked away seeing things differently." Jerome gave a small nod in return as they turned and walked away toward their own cars. As soon as they were out of earshot, Ty turned to him with an enormous grin. "See?" he said, practically vibrating with excitement. "Told you people would love it." Jerome chuckled, finally starting the truck. "You were right, kid. You were right." As they pulled out of the parking lot, Jerome felt something settle deep in his chest, something he hadn't quite expected. Pride. Not just in the work he did, but in the way people had come to see it, even if only for a moment. He had never needed their validation. He had always known the value of what he did. But today, for the first time, they knew it too. The truck rumbled steadily down the road, the low hum of the engine filling the cabin as Jerome steered them toward home. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden hue over the city streets. The buildings, the traffic, the people moving about their routines, all of it felt oddly distant to him, as if his mind was still lingering back in that school auditorium. Ty sat beside him, his seatbelt fastened snugly across his chest, his feet swinging slightly as he replayed the day in vivid detail. "And when you told the story about fixing that Mustang," he said, nearly bouncing in his seat, "Caleb leaned over to me and was like, 'Your dad is so cool.'" He turned toward Jerome, his face glowing with pride. "And then, when you explained how engines work, even the teachers were listening. Did you see their faces? They were actually interested." Jerome smiled to himself, eyes still focused on the road ahead. "Yeah, I saw." It was a strange feeling, knowing he had captured their attention. Knowing that, for once, they hadn't just seen a mechanic. They had seen something more. For years, Jerome had accepted the way people looked at him when they realized what he did for a living. Some were indifferent, some dismissive, and a few were outright condescending, as if a man who worked with his hands was somehow less than someone who sat in an office. He had never let it get to him. He knew his worth, knew that his skills mattered, that his work kept people moving, kept lives running smoothly. But today had been different. Today they had listened, not because he had forced them to, not because he had demanded their respect, but because he had simply told them the truth. Ty was still chattering, flipping through his school notebook as if he wanted to write down every detail before he forgot. Jerome let his son's voice wash over him, feeling a warmth settle deep in his chest. "You know," Ty said suddenly, more thoughtful now, "before today, I always thought the most important jobs were the ones you see in movies, like being a superhero or a doctor or a pilot. But now I think maybe important jobs are just the ones that help people." Jerome glanced at him, surprised by the quiet wisdom in his words. "That's exactly right," he said after a pause. "Every job that helps people is important." Ty nodded, satisfied with his realization, and went back to flipping through his notes. As they drove through their neighborhood, the familiar sights of home came into view. The corner store, where Jerome picked up supplies, the old oak tree standing tall in the middle of the block, the small auto shop that had become an extension of himself. He had built that place from the ground up, had poured everything he had into making it something reliable, something honest, and for the first time in a long time, he realized just how much that mattered. He pulled into their driveway, letting the engine idle for a moment before shutting it off. Ty hopped out first, already heading toward the front steps, but Jerome lingered for a second, his hands resting on the steering wheel. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. A quiet evening was settling over the neighborhood, the kind that made everything feel just a little bit slower, a little bit more grounded. Jerome exhaled, rubbing a hand over his chin. He had spent years doing his work without expecting anyone outside of his customers to notice it. He had never needed applause, never needed validation. But today, standing in front of that room, seeing Ty's face light up, watching those parents nod in quiet understanding, he had felt something shift. Maybe, for the first time, he had seen himself the way his son saw him. Not just as a man who fixed cars, but as someone who made a difference. And that, he realized, was enough. With that thought settling deep in his bones, Jerome stepped out of the truck, stretched his arms, and followed his son inside, where the scent of home and the sound of Ty's laughter welcomed him back. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out more of our videos for inspiring stories like this, and don't forget to share this video with friends and family.